Baldur's Gate 3 was an absolutely incredible RPG. It was in a lot of ways a genre-defining RPG for this decade, the 2020s. And I don't think we're going to be seeing the basically all the things that you're going to learn from Baldur's Gate 3 for quite some time, given that it just released last year. But it's a game that brought us so many compelling companions like, Gale, and then also like Karlach, and that's not Elminster.
Get out!
But it's also a game that I think a lot of big RPG studios can learn from. Like games that are currently in development that may still have time to make some changes over as they're going through the process. Like, say, a Witcher 4, or an Elder Scrolls 6, which hasn't even begun. Or perhaps even a Mass Effect 5 if BioWare does well with Dragon Age 4, the Veilguard. Quite honestly, all of these games, which generally come from perhaps even bigger studios than Larian, much bigger studios than Larian, well, they could learn a whole lot of things. Because you see, Baldur's Gate 3 was a watershed moment for the gaming industry. It represented a game that seemingly did a lot wrong, but exceeded every expectation. It was a turn-based game in an era of games going for flashier and bigger action combat, often tied to consoles. It was a pseudo-open world with a 3-act structure in an era where everything was trying to go into these big open worlds. It was also early access at a time when that was, and honestly still remains, a bit of a bad term in many gaming circles. And it was in early access for 3 years, prolonging the idea that it would honestly never launch. It's easy to forget now, but many of the reviews leading up to the game finally announcing when it would be launched were very uncertain if it ever would launch, assuming that it would just be in early access forever. It was also a mature themed RPG highlighted by its mature 17+ tag. By leaning into this mature ESRB rating, you're automatically kind of limiting your potential audience, or so it seemed. To put that rating in perspective, specifically, Baldur's Gate 2 is rated T for teen, the largest possible audience they could get. And all of those things that they did were the right decisions. Even forgoing the idea of real-time with pause combat, which the prior games in the genre, the prior games in the series had actually done. And some of the biggest CRPGs of the time had done. At least in this silly YouTuber's experience who has an octopus sitting on his computer with shit tons of RGB. Basically someone who has no game dev experience and no marketing experience. So obviously I am the number one authority to talk. We're just gonna move on. But these are 4 really important things that I think we need to talk about that game studios can learn from what Larian did with Baldur's Gate 3. And I'll admit right now, the 4th one, I get a little upset and a little passionate because it means something to me. The first thing someone like CD Projekt Red can learn from Larian is lean into what you know. One of the most controversial decisions made around Baldur's Gate 3 before it even launched was that instead of Larian going and making a real-time pause combat game like previous Baldur's Gate games had been, instead they made a Baldur's Gate 3 that looked a whole lot like their previous CRPGs, Divinity Original Sin 1 and 2. So much so that people went as far as to call Baldur's Gate 3 Divinity Original Sins 3. But that was a good thing. Larian's catalog wasn't real-time with pause when they pitched it to Wizards of the Coast, that they could make this game. Their 2 biggest games were deep strategic turn-based combat RPGs. That is what they knew how to do, what their team was trained around making. I firmly believe this bedrock knowledge and foundation is what allowed them to make such a satisfying combat in BG3, even when they butted up against the limitations they faced when adapting it to D&D 5e, because they knew what they were working with. They had the blueprint. I wouldn't trust Larian to make an action RPG or an MMO because they've proven themselves to be adept at CRPGs. Leaning into the knowledge system and tools you've built out will allow for things to be done faster and in a more complete way because frankly, you've fucking done it before. You know the pitfalls, you know the issues. You'll be able to see once it's done, oh no, this isn't right, it needs to be tweaked a little bit, we need to change this. And with this, it's easier to take all the side paths off the road you already know because, well, you freaking know it. It's a road you've been down before, and that lets you explore the places you haven't been yet, with a solid bedrock to return to.
Focus, dedication, utmost vigilance.
I braved lapping waters and leaking ships to find this prey. I butchered many, and will butcher many more. But this one I toy with. I slice, I tear, and when the time is right, I will bite its head off and bathe in its innards.
The second thing is gonna be pretty much an RPG thing. It's not so much a general gaming thing as much as an RPG thing. Stories, well, they freaking matter, but not just the main quest. When I say something like stories matter, I'm not just saying a story matters. One of the brilliant approaches for Baldur's Gate 3 was specifically through side quests and companion stories, as they created all these incredible, compelling narratives that were in addition to a primary story. Some were shorter, just taking a few moments, while others spanned the entire game. But one thing stood out. These secondary stories stood on their own. Whether it was Auntie Ethel, a companion story, or Raphael, all of these mattered. And they did often connect in some ways to the main story. The story of, well, we've got this little wriggly fucker in my head and it's eating my brain and I really don't want it there anymore. But they existed separately as well. What it felt like was Larian took individual RPG storylines or Dungeons & Dragons campaigns and shrunk them down into their own contained stories. Then they found the connections and how they would shift and move based on the large narrative and what was going on in the world. Quite honestly, they often surpassed the main story. The reason why I highlight this so much is because it allowed that main story, the main narrative, to at times have lulls. It was a well-crafted orchestra rather than a single instrument, which let each part have a bit more breathing room to fall flat at times, and a bit more room to leave a mark. And it certainly did. I don't believe that the main narrative of Baldur's Gate 3 had any deep, strong impact on me as I was reading it. It wasn't like some great book or something like that. But what did, the things that have stuck with me are some of those companion stories, things that had so many great emotional beats as you were going through them that they made me cry. Like, they made me cry as I was reading it, which is generally a reaction I have when a writing is done so well as to pull me into the story, to really bring me into that world and feel those things and forget that I'm just playing a video game or reading a book or watching a movie. For number 3, we go back to something that Larian knew, or thought they knew, at least they aimed for. Know your audience. Really important. Like, for me, I know that my audience likes Baldur's Gate 3 and RPGs. That's pretty basic, but it's an important thing for me to know. In an interview with Edge magazine, Baldur's Gate 3 art director Elena Dubrovna explained that Baldur's Gate 3 was made for a modern audience. The game was designed around people that may not have played the first 2 Baldur's Gate games, but even beyond that, to people that were completely unfamiliar with D&D itself. They focused on making the game have exciting choices visually and narratively for people to enjoy, whether they had that familiarity or not. But at the same time, lead writer for the game Adam Smith talked about how throughout the process they sought to live up to the canon of the prior games and tried to pull in recognizable elements from the original 2 games, like, for example, Jaheira.
It was Baal alone we faced in our time. And bad as that was, he had no elder brain for a lapdog then.
I think this was smart because while Baldur's Gate 1 and 2 were storied games with a deeply passionate fan base, they were also games that were 25 and 23 years old, respectively, by the time Baldur's Gate 3 would launch. 2.5 decades is a long time, and understandably some of those fans of the games back then would have kind of grown out of the series or moved on. It also plays in the first point about doing what Larian knows. Baldur's Gate 1 and 2 were real-time with pause RPGs made for PC. Larian was never going to make that type of game. They needed to have a broader audience than what they were looking at because they weren't going to be able to just basically emulate exactly what Baldur's Gate 1 and 2 had done and just recreate it in 2023. But at the same time, you don't want to tell a series devoted fans to just fuck off and say that the game's not for them. You want to find ways to bridge those gaps because you know that you're trying to appeal to multiple different audiences. You're trying to find the things that matter the most to those important audiences and try and lean into those as much as you can while not signaling to the other audience that they just don't matter. Basically, they had to know, what is the audience concern going to be for the people that love this IP? Is it going to be the characters? Is it the combat? Is it the world? What are the things that matter the most to them? And then look at this other audience over here and say, well, this audience that has no idea what this game is, what's gonna matter to them? Basically, just knowing who your people are that you're trying to get this game to. Who is going to enjoy this game? Or at least, who do you hope will enjoy this game? And honestly, they kind of managed to hit all those audiences. Although, yeah, of course, obviously there's people that were upset in different ways for different things, but they hit the audiences they wanted to hit for the most part. Now, I did say that there's one of these that would be upsetting for me, or at least emotional, and that's what this fourth one is. So I'm gonna apologize here because I am gonna get a little emotional. Number 4 is a really important one, and it's one of those that I think is even more important now as we've gone through what amounts to a couple years now of layoff after layoff after layoff with developers. Lesson 4 is your developers fucking matter and stop firing them, you fuck nuggets. That's it. Just stop firing people all the time to please investors. You're not firing people because it makes your product better. You're firing people because you misjudged. You're firing people because you don't know how to make your numbers look better to investors because you thought you were going to make this much money and then you didn't. You messed up and then you're cutting away things. And anyway, that's my opinion. We need to get back to what Larian actually says. And they actually had a shit ton to say about this.
We don't have shareholders, but we also don't think about them.
While Larian was collecting award after award for Baldur's Gate 3, they often used that platform to advocate for a healthier environment for the gaming industry. They called the game industry layoffs an avoidable fuck-up, and said that it was simply not true that the industry-wide layoffs were inevitable. In the same interview, Larian's Michael Dowse went on to say that big companies are not nimble, and being nimble was important. But it gets darker than that. They pointed out that none of the companies laying off employees are at risk of going bankrupt. Instead, he proposes that they're at risk of pissing off shareholders. But it goes way beyond that. Just saying big companies bad wouldn't really be all that actionable, nor would it hold as much weight given that Larian itself is actually a damn big company with 7 studios now and hundreds of employees while they work on 2 new RPGs, having grown a ton while they were making Baldur's Gate 3. So we now turn to Sven and his speech at the Game Developers Conference. Greed has been fucking this whole thing up for so long, he said, going on to explain that he's been seeing the same mistakes over and over since he's been in the industry. People that don't play the games or make the games making decisions based on projections and then needing to lay off a bunch of people when those projections don't come through. Obviously, this creates a human cost, but it's not just employees who get laid off who face it, but also the employees who remain. In the end of it all, creating games is still an art form. And to create art, it requires an environment that is conducive to it. If you're constantly worrying about layoffs, regardless of success or failure, like what the hell, Bungie? You also break up the consistency of your teams. You get rid of a lot of that institutional knowledge that you had grown and the people that knew what they were doing. Remember point 1? Do what you know? Well, if you fire the people that knew how to do that thing, you no longer know how to do that. Someone's notes aren't going to teach the new junior that you just hired. It's just not how that shit works. But don't take my word for it, because again, still a YouTuber, never worked in game dev. Take Sven's word for it. As he said in a speech at GDC, reported by Eurogamer, in this quote, "It's always the quarterly profits. The only thing that matters are the numbers, and then you fire everybody, and the next year you say, shit, I'm out of developers. And then you start hiring people again, and then you do acquisitions, and then you put them through the same loop again, and it's just broken. You don't have to. You can make reserves. Just slow down a bit. Slow down on the greed. Be resilient. Take care of the people. Don't lose the institutional knowledge that's been built up in the people you lose every single time. So you have to go through the same cycle over and over and over. Really pisses me off. I don't think you can put it in a better, more succinct way than what Sven said right there. You are basically restarting a cycle every time you lay off the people that know what they're doing. I am excited as hell for Dragon Age the Veilguard, and in part of that is because of all the writers that were still working on that game. But before they launched the game, they let go of so much institutional knowledge through layoffs, laying off people that had written Dragon Age the Veilguard, that had written prior Dragon Age games. One of the most consistent through lines of those games, when everything else was kind of changing around it, was the writing. And they just got rid of it. So that makes me more worried, not about Dragon Age the Veilguard, but about a Dragon Age 5, because they got rid of all that knowledge that they had through layoffs that were completely avoidable, at least in my opinion. Larian's approach appears to be to treat game development like a game they want to play, and treat the people that work on those games, the team of people working on them, like people they actually care about, and not simply salaries on an investor portfolio. And it turns out treating your developers like people, well, it kind of seems to pay off, with one of the most awarded games ever in history. In fact, you know what? I think it's time for me to shut up, because I've been out of depth for most of this conversation. And I think I want to turn it over to one of those award ceremonies. One of the award ceremonies where Larian had a lot of really good things to say.
This is existential to us, as you can tell from all the emotion on David's face. We're very lucky. We've had a lot of stage time. Others are not so lucky. This is a really human industry, and we're really bad sometimes at showing developers what they're worth and showing the players at home that we care about them. It's kind of the elephant in the room, especially surrounded by all this opulence, which, you know, can only go so far. Without people, we would not be standing here. Without the people that work on these games, we would not be standing here. Many, many people were let go at the start of this year. I want you all to know that you are talented and that you matter and that you are the future of this industry. Don't let that flame be extinguished by our collective mistakes. I know that everyone here is scared because shit's really fucked up. All of your projections are wrong, and it's scary. But we persevere as an industry, we will persevere as an industry, and you will all find your place, and you will all be welcomed back with open arms, and we'll still be making games for the players and for you, and with these guys.
This, I think, was a very important portion, not just for fans of the game like myself to hear, but also developers of games, people that are currently working on games. You watching this may be an indie developer considering working on a game, or we're working on one currently. But I think this is a great place to end it.